name is Hugh Cross. I'm chair of the program committee of the Museum of Healthcare, and one of the fun things I get to do is introduce things like this. And this is an event which we have been looking forward to for quite a while, and it seems impossible to believe that it's finally come to fruition. As obviously you already know, we're going to open the Nursing Gallery exhibit today, and part of the program after this part is to go over and see it, and it really is amazing. But before that, we have a stellar array of speakers, the subject being for service to humanity, nursing education at the Kingston General Hospital. And our first speaker is Dr. Diane Dodd, and you'll forgive me for reading the introduction because the introductions are quite stellar and a little bit lengthy because they are stellar. And I tried to memorize them all, but I failed. So Dr. Diane Dodd is currently the coordinator of the Women's History Initiative at the National Office of Parks Canada, working toward enhancing the commemoration of women's history in Canada. She received her doctorate from Carleton University in 1988, following which she did postdoctoral fellowship at the Hanna Institute for the History of Medicine, where she conducted research into the public health physician, Dr. Helen Murchie. She also worked as an archivist at the National Archives of Canada before coming to Parks Canada. As a historian for Parks Canada for the past 11 years, she has written a number of framework studies investigating commemorative opportunities in specific aspects of women's history, such as health and education, as well as research reports leading to the designations of historic sites, persons, and events. Her survey report on nurses' residences in 1997 led to the designation of 5 nurses' residences in Canada. Most recently, she has edited a bilingual volume of essays on the history of nursing with Christina Bates and Nicole Rousseau called On All Frontiers, 4 Centuries of Canadian Nursing, published jointly by the Canadian Museum of Civilization and Ottawa University Press. It was launched in conjunction with the 2005 museum exhibit on nursing at the CMC. The title of Dr. Dodd's talk this evening is A Place of Their Own, Purpose-Built Architecture for Nurses.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes. Thank you for the introduction. I've been asked to speak about how the Anne Bailey Building became a National Historic Site. But before I do that, I want to thank Dr. Lowe and everyone associated with the museum for inviting me here, inviting me back to the Anne Bailey Building to help celebrate a second milestone. And I also want to congratulate the staff, the volunteers, the curatorial team, the nurse alumni, everybody associated with the board, of course, of the Museum of Healthcare, on a new exhibit that will add immeasurably to the interpretation of nursing and indirectly of women in Canada. In 1999, I had the honor of participating in the plaque unveiling ceremony on the lawn of the Anne Bailey Building, with hundreds of proud alumni nurses present. That moment, when Anne Bailey became a National Historic Site, still counts as one of the biggest highlights of my work as an historian at Parks Canada. But this moment, right now, later, actually, when we cut the ribbon, made me an even bigger highlight. Like most historic sites, the Anne Bailey Building can trace its beginnings to dedicated local activists and volunteers who fought a long and hard battle to preserve a building that could so easily have fallen victim to the wrecker's ball. Luckily, Anne Bailey resides within a community rich in heritage resources and people willing to take care of them. This is reflected first in the 1995 designation of the Kingston General Hospital as a National Historic Site. The district plaque that stands in front of the hospital notes that the KGHA is one of Canada's oldest functioning hospitals, and one that evokes the changing role of the hospital from a charitable custodian of the poor to a center of modern medicine and surgery. The Anne Bailey building represents the integral part that nurses played in this transformation and serves as a symbol of the development of nursing as a profession. And in its early years, of course, it is a profession for women. Anne Bailey joins a very small number of historic sites that interpret Canadian women's history. In the early 1990s, Parks Canada, which was then under the Minister of Heritage, put a strategic priority on the commemoration of three groups: women, Aboriginal, and ethnocultural communities, recognizing that these groups were underrepresented in the program. Indeed, of the nearly 2,000 federal commemorations of sites, persons, and events, there were less than 100, or 5%, associated with women's historic achievements. Women were particularly underrepresented in the built environment, with only 9 historic sites. That's in 1990. To map out a strategy to improve the commemoration of women, outside experts were invited to a series of national workshops on that subject. Among other things, they suggested that framework studies be conducted into a number of areas in which women were known to be active. One of these was on women in healthcare. This was my first project, conducting this study as a Parks Canada historian. Looking into the field of women in healthcare, we found that a few pioneer women doctors, many of them involved in the early 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century battle to gain suffrage, had been designated, but very few nurses. In fact, the only nurses who had received similar recognition were Georgina Fane Pope and Major Margaret MacDonald, early matrons of the Military Nursing Corps. I wondered why it was that nurses, who constituted the largest group of female healthcare workers, had been so neglected. In looking at this aspect of healthcare and wondering if we could improve our dismal record of sites associated with women at the same time, the study took inspiration from architectural historian Anne-Marie Adams' 1994 article on the nurses' residence at Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. When the HSMBC, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, reviewed the healthcare study, it was suggested that we conduct a further study or a survey of nurses' residences across Canada, and I was assigned that task. Nurses' residences were obvious centerpieces for nursing history, chiefly because, well, there's probably more than one reason, but chiefly because they were one of the few examples of purpose-built architecture for women in the urban environment. The only exceptions really being mother houses, convents, hospitals, and schools built by women religious. As well, nurses identified very strongly with nurses' residences, including not just the leaders, but the rank and file nurses, and we wanted to speak to them as well. Also, nurses' alumni associations, and they were an important group who played a critical role in building and preserving the nurses' residences. It seems that the nurses' residence was universally seen as a place that afforded nurses a measure of autonomy and allowed them to gain both an education and to forge an identity as an emerging profession. Or to recall the words of Virginia Woolf, it gave them a room of their own. Although a number of the early residences had either been destroyed or renovated beyond recognition, there were still quite a number of them to survey. Where should we start to choose one or several that best reflected the historic values associated with nursing? That was my task. To help the board make a selection or a decision, we articulated a set of criteria. First, and most obviously, the building had to be extant. We didn't want to develop an empty site. And also it had to retain a degree of architectural integrity. That simply means that the fabric, layout, and setting of the original building had to still be able to evoke the nurses' lives as students living in the residence. In searching for our perfect nurses' residence, our criteria also sought a residence that was located within an existing hospital setting in order to link the student nurses to their work on the hospital wards, which was also clearly very important. Our criteria stressed that the nurses' residence should be purpose-built, and that simply means a building that was designed and built for the express purpose of housing student nurses during their hospital training. This was important to the theme of the emerging nurses profession. Nursing leaders, physicians, and hospital administrators deliberately built impressive, purpose-built homes and educational institutions in an effort to attract and retain a new professional corps of nurses. Indeed, such buildings often represented the victories of nursing leaders and or alumni associations who fought to ensure that overworked student nurses were provided with accommodation that was a cut above the earlier arrangement of placing them in overcrowded hospital wards. Nurses' residences were places where they could separate their work lives from their leisure lives, and where they could receive an education. These residences also served to reassure parents of student nurses that their daughters' respectability would be well guarded by the matrons who supervised them in the stately but home-like environment. We felt that the nurses' residence should be purpose-built for all of the above reasons, even though we knew that many nurses' residences across Canada were not purpose-built. In smaller hospitals and or communities, especially in the eastern provinces, we found that many residences were actually converted homes or other buildings converted from another use. In the West, many nurses stayed in tiny cottage hospitals where there was no residence at all. And as well, within the Catholic hospital system, particularly in French Canada, convents or hospital wards were all often used to house nursing students. Because the nurses' residence was so closely linked to education and the building of a profession, the criteria also sought to find a residence that had been built during the period in which nurses formed their profession. So setting such a date is an arbitrary act, but we used the period from 1890 to 1939 as the period in which nurses had established themselves as a profession. We also wanted to ensure that each residence retained features that could speak to the three main functions of a nurse's residence. And they were, one, a home for the student nurses; two, a place that provided space for education of nurses; and three, a place that provided a space for leisure and social activities. So these were the main criteria that were used. However, we also looked for buildings that would have a secure future, potential partners to take the lead on interpretation and preservation, archival material cultural resources to help research the building and its changing roles over time. And although not critical, we felt that a university affiliation and or an association with a major nursing leader would be an asset. The Anne Bailey building met most of the criteria. It was and still is an extant purpose-built former nurses' residence situated in the heart of an unusually well-preserved hospital. In fact, it's already designated. It was built in 1903-04, which falls in the early part of the period of professionalization of nursing that we had articulated. Indeed, it was the oldest of the nurses' residences identified in the survey. It certainly spoke to the principal functions in that it served as a home for students. Indeed, the early name of the building was the Anne Bailey Nurses' Home. Among its 22 rooms were a number of bedrooms, and we know that leisure and social space was available in the lounge with its welcoming fireplace, where visitors could be received, as well the exterior, which featured a roomy veranda, certainly added to leisure opportunities. Educational space is an important component of nurse professionalization, but it wasn't quite as evident at Anne Bailey as it was in some of the older residences identified in the survey. Although there were rumors that there was a room in the basement used as a classroom. I don't think that's ever been firmly established, but had it not been the case, we can imagine that education would have been improvised in many of the ways that the early nursing leaders had to do. The Anne Bailey building was built during the period really before nurses had a solid grounding in education, and it did not contain the classrooms, labs, and other modern amenities of residences built in the 1920s. But we know that the extension that was built in 1926 contained classrooms. As far as the secure future, potential partners, and archival records and artifacts is concerned, it is clearly evident from the work that has gone into this historic opening that Anne Bailey has these qualities in spades. When the Historic Sites and Monuments Board met to consider and make its recommendations on the survey of nurses' residences, they chose 5 from a list of 12 potential sites. The Anne Bailey, of course, was among them. The others were the Royal Victoria Hospital in the Hershey Pavilion of the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, which has a 1906 and a 1932 wing. The St. Boniface Hospital School of Nursing in Winnipeg, which was built in 1928. The Mailloux Pavilion, built in 1931 at Notre Dame Hospital in Montreal, associated with the Grey Nuns. And Begley Hall, built in 1926 at Royal Victoria Hospital in Victoria, BC. Interestingly, when the board made its recommendation, it suggested that interpretation should, that we should go into discussions with the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal as to interpretation of nursing at that institution. That, for various reasons, did not happen, but it's interesting that it's now happening here at Anne Bailey, largely through local initiatives. I mentioned earlier that in 1990, there were only 9 National Historic Sites associated with women. Today, there are 26. Anne Bailey has been a part of that quantitative leap. But creating a historic site, such as the Anne Bailey building, is just a beginning, a moment of accomplishment in which Parks Canada and the Historic Sites and Monuments Board played a small role. Building a National Historic Site that truly evokes and interprets its reasons for designation that educates Canadians on its significance is an immense and daunting task that takes decades of labor and research. The opening of what may be, I think is, the first permanent exhibit on nursing in Canada, certainly it is the only one that is housed in a former nurse's residence, is an historic occasion. It is an important step in building a network of historic sites that represent the true diversity of Canadian life, not just in healthcare, but in other areas too. Congratulations to all that were involved in this project, and I want to thank you again for letting me be here to help celebrate this milestone occasion. Thank you.